Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Thanks everyone for joining us at this event of the Karl Popper Society. I'm very pleased to welcome Chiara Marletto, who's a physicist at Oxford and a research fellow at Wolfson College, where she does theoretical physics, specifically foundations of quantum physics, kind of foundations of thermodynamics, constructive theory. And we will be talking today with her about her recently published book, which I have here, The Science of Can and Can't. And the format of the talk will be that we're going to have a conversation for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. And that being said, first of all, I want to praise the book. I thought it was really wonderful. I thought it was an amazing book, specifically because it has this. It's nice to see an author argue a case. You're not just summarizing knowledge about science that we already know and that we've known for a long time, but you're trying to point out the ways in which as you call it, the prevailing conception of physics is deficient. There's certain inadequacies with it that you want to solve and that we should want to solve, and that you have a kind of, in a way, a radical new theory for solving, which relies on counterfactuals. And where I wanted to start the conversation is with kind of opening question of what are counterfactuals and how do they fit into physics?
Yes, I think the way in which I use counterfactuals in the book is a bit different from the general way in which counterfactuals are understood, I think, in philosophy or in mathematics. And in a way, the counterfactuals I'm using are much more specific to physics. So in general, with counterfactuals, one refers to facts that are about not what happens, but what could happen or could have happened, for example. This is a very general notion that can apply in different contexts. But in physics, I think the most important counterfactuals are those related to constraints about what transformations are possible and what transformations are impossible. So that's the type of counterfactual that's important to the book and to constructive theory more generally, which is this view that was proposed by David Deutsch as a kind of generalization of the quantum theory of computation to the whole of physics, and as these counterfactuals as at the heart of its new way of explaining reality in a way. And so an example of a counterfactual law is, which is very well known beyond physics, I think, is the conservation of energy. So in traditional physics, when you have like Newton's laws, you can describe various things about what happens to objects when you push them around in various ways. By giving like trajectories of how these objects move in space and time with some initial conditions. But also these trajectories are constrained in a more general way by this law, which is the conservation of energy, which, if you think about it, is not really expressed as a dynamical law. It's not a law of motion, like, for example, Newton's laws, but it says that it's impossible to change the energy of a system without having some side effects somewhere else. So without changing the energy of another system somewhere else in the universe. And this is a very general statement. So it doesn't really focus on a specific dynamical law. It's a more general statement than Newton's laws themselves, because this applies to like a much more general set of laws, for example, quantum theory or general relativity, etc. And the central constraint of the law is about forbidding certain transformations. So it's a counterfactual core. So that's an example of the type of counterfactuals that are important for the book.
Very nice. And the view that you're arguing against, in some sense, is this thing you call the prevailing conception, which is that you have, like, typically in physics, we have equations of motion and initial conditions, as you just said. And we use those to describe the behavior of physical systems. But there's various inadequacies with that view about how physics operates, despite the fact that it is, as the name suggests, like completely widespread. Like you're kind of it's hard to find fundamental physics where you're not dealing with equations of motion and initial conditions. But so, yeah, I think, what are some of these deficiencies that you think exist within the prevailing conception?
I think it's nice that you referred to this at the start of the conversation, because that's also why, let's say in the book, this comes early on, because the book really wants to be a description of a number of problems with this conception. The problem with explaining what the problem is with the prevailing or traditional conception is that, as you said, it's very successful, and it's been a prevailing mode of explanation within fundamental physics for centuries, essentially since, well, officially I would say since Newton, but it started before that as well. Even the ancient Greeks were trying to describe, for example, trajectories of objects being like arrows and so on. So in a sense, it's an intuitive and very effective way of describing, of explaining actually things that happen around us. The fact of trying to first say, well, I want a law that says how they move about. So it's a very kind of intuitive thing to try to do. And then Newton found a universal law that explained how, at the time, we thought all objects in the universe should behave and move about. And then this was then challenged later, and quantum theory and general relativity improved on that law. But essentially, they stayed within the same paradigm of providing trajectories and initial conditions. It's true that there is another part of physics that is also very important, and it's kind of also provides a lot of explanatory material for the way in which we look at the world around us, which is basically the conception that's at the root of thermodynamics. And thermodynamics is this beast that emerged at some point as more or less as a kind of heuristic, maybe empirical science that was proposed to understand how energy and heat and work can power engines, in a sense. And the core of thermodynamics isn't dynamical, but it's counterfactual. So it's about forbidding certain transformations and allowing others. So other than thermodynamics, I guess, and other than information theory, which was recently brought into physics through quantum information, the most fundamental explanations come in this form of laws of motion and initial conditions. And this is very limiting, because so I think most physicists would say that as soon as you find a phenomenon that cannot be cast whose explanation can't be cast in this way with laws of motion and initial conditions, then you end up having to kind of give up on explaining the phenomenon itself. And so this has led to physics, and I would guess science more generally, trying to have maybe some very approximative and hand-waving ways of talking about these phenomena, such as phenomena that underlie things like life and information and so on, but without really attempting to creating a fundamental theory of these things. So one big limitation with the traditional conception is that it leads us to give up on having exact laws, explanatory laws about these phenomena that are also very relevant to physics.
Yes.
And the other problem is the fact that the dynamical laws require this specification of initial conditions. So when you say, how a certain object moves, you have to specify where it starts from and with what velocity and so on. And I think this theory of the initial conditions, which is required both for objects inside the universe, but if you think of a fundamental law of physics, you would like to have it for the universe as a whole. is a kind of beast that doesn't quite, it's not a dynamical law itself. So it's a different type of theory. And at present, the theories of initial conditions that physics has come up with are conjectures, but they're not quite thought through in the same way that, say, quantum theory and general relativity are. And they present a problem because it's also hard to test them, and it's hard to fit them into the rest of the narrative. So these are the two big problems with the traditional conception, and there are others.
Yes, yeah. So if I understand it correctly, then it's like if we're trying to take the prevailing conception seriously, then all kinds of things that we think are important in everyday life, and like the and other areas of science like biology, the fact that genes can propagate and things like that, all have to be reduced to just accidental behaviors of things that are somehow, for some reason, part of the initial conditions of the universe, because that is the only thing that can really determine their behavior. And that kind of makes all of those things into a parochial fact about the world, and that you can't really get a proper description of them within fundamental physics, because fundamental physics is completely described in terms of these initial conditions and equations of motion. Is that a good summary of?
Yes, exactly. And so an example of how problematic this worldview becomes is this. If you imagine like a computer running some computer program running on a computer, and you have a question like, why is this particular bit off at this time? The traditional conception would answer that question by saying, well, it's off because a few seconds ago it was on, and then before that it was off again, and then all the way back to the initial conditions that were set for the computer. And actually, as you said, all the way back to the conditions that were set for the universe, because the computer just arose in the context of the universe evolving and so on. But that completely misses the point, because there is another type of explanation for what's going on, which is testable and also important to explain the reality as it is, which is to say, well, it's off because it encodes 3 together with these other bits, and this is the output of an algorithm that was intended to factor a number, and the input was 15, and so on. So this type of explanation I just mentioned is as important as the first. It's a different level of explanation, but it's required to provide a complete picture of the situation that we're talking about. And so, abstracting away from this analogy, I think in general with physics, the traditional conception only narrows down explanations to the first kind of explanation, which of course it can be useful in some situations, but can't explain the whole of the particular situation that we're talking about. And this is very problematic. So in that sense, this is also why I found this idea that David had was very, very interesting when I first stumbled upon it, because I did feel like there was something missing in the way we were doing some kind of fundamental science. And it was very nice to see that there was a different way of formulating laws, which are also testable and so on, but that can sort of remedy this deficiency of the traditional conception.
Yes, yeah, it's amazing how widespread the traditional conception really is. But when reading the book, I was thinking about when I first encountered thermodynamics and how I kind of, in hindsight, almost completely missed the point of it. Because in my mind, thermodynamics was just, well, we have these theories of atoms, they're bouncing around, and then we have the theory of a gas and of the heat of a gas. And the kind of emergent properties of the gas are like temperature and things like that. But they really only just emergent attributes that come into existence because you're talking about very large systems with many atoms. But there's nothing kind of fundamental about temperature in the sense that you won't find the temperature of an atom in this worldview. But that's not what thermodynamics really is. Thermodynamics is something different. Like you have thermodynamics and then you have statistical mechanics, and statistical mechanics is just the working out of the equations of motion. Thermodynamics is kind of the theory above that. It's Yes, and I again, to kind of say, I guess, to the audience, and also just as something interesting, I think I completely missed that point when I first encountered thermodynamics, and I think only when like reading the constructive theory papers that I start to understand, like, oh, there's actually the fundamental difference between, for example, statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, which is much more fundamental.
Yes, and I think maybe something of interest to this audience specifically is the fact that there's a misconception, I think, in the physics community, at least the one that I'm in touch with, whereby people think that the only rigorously testable theories are those that are formulated as ultimately dynamical equations and initial conditions, and that's exactly why somehow statistical mechanics was created, because people were trying, like Boltzmann, for example, to find a way of underpinning these general high-level laws of thermodynamics within the microscopic dynamics of particles and so on. And I think this is a misconception. So the principles are testable as much as dynamical laws, and so it's somehow this is not so appreciated within physics. And this is also why people tend to shy away from principles, and they try always to reduce them to trajectories of particles and so on. But in doing so, I think you miss a lot, because in the way in which science makes progress, one of the main ingredients is that you have to make conjectures, and these conjectures about, say, future dynamical laws have to be guided by something. And they can't be guided just simply by looking at the current dynamical laws and not trying to abstract away some details of these dynamical laws to try to make the guess. So it's very hard to make a guess without having a higher level principle that tells you which bits of this dynamical law are really essential to the explanatory power of the law, and which ones are just accessory and they happen to be like this because of, say, the particular mathematical form of the law. I think time and again in the past, these guesses about laws, dynamical laws, came both from mathematical type of reasoning, but as well as principle-based type of reasoning. And I think nowadays we've maybe lost a bit this principle-based type of reasoning. And in a way, I'm hoping that with this work that we are doing, perhaps this could be of use also to those people who are looking for the next theory, which will come, next after quantum theory and general relativity.
Yes, yeah, you have a very nice dialogue in the book about exactly that topic, about how do we guess for the new theories. And I think you kind of nicely summarize with that dialogue kind of the tension that exists today in the physics community, where it really is a tension between wanting to work in the prevailing conception and thinking that these principles are of importance and that they will provide like useful material for future work. I guess so, maybe to move on to like the more constructive theoretic or the details of constructive theory, because the work that you're doing has not just so there's these issues in the prevailing conception, and some of them prevent us from talking about, for example, information at a fundamental level. And your work in constructive theory has incorporated information into fundamental physics. And again, I remember reading that and thinking how, what an interesting problem that is, because information is one of these things which it's easy to think it's just purely abstract, because it doesn't seem to be confined to any particular physical system. Information seems to be, like, as you would say in the book, or as you would say, it's copyable from your computer to other physical materials, like maybe a CD or to a book, and yet it's the same kind of information. And so it seems like there's no kind of grounding the idea of information into physics, because it's so independent of whatever it is that you're instantiating it in. But within constructive theory, you can actually incorporate these kinds of concepts into physics. And so, could you elaborate on how that's done?
Yes, I think this is a very nice example of where this logic of counterfactuals helps. Because if you try to look at the physical foundations of information just within the traditional conception of physics, so with dynamical laws, somehow the problem of understanding what information is physically is, well, somehow is dissolved. There's no way of phrasing even the problem within that conception, because even the idea of a computer, the way we define an object to be a computer, or at least intuitively we think of an object as being a computer, is not quite accommodated within the idea that the universe is running on this specific trajectory that's singled out by its initial condition, because a computer is an object that can be programmed in different ways. And even if, say, it just sits there and it never is used to do any computation, the fact that it could be programmed to host a number of different bit values than the one that's initialized with is the very property that makes the computer a computer. And so the key property of a computer is the fact that it could be programmed in a number of different ways. And likewise for a bit, if you try to understand the bit from the point of view of the traditional conception, at best you can, as you said, list a number of systems with different dynamical models. I don't know, a photon, an electron, neutron, etc., obeying different equations of motions, all of which are somehow, have some features in common. But if you just look at the dynamical laws, they all look different from each other, and it's very hard to express the concept of a bit out of this variety of dynamics that you have. But the fact that is in common between all of these dynamics, and that's what makes the bit a bit, is the fact that this object, this system in question, which can be instantiated in different ways, has a number of states too, which can be flipped into each other. So 0 goes into 1 and 1 goes into 0, and that can be copied if you have a replica of the same system. And these two properties are about basically two types of tasks being possible. And to express that, this regularity that's required for laws of nature to allow for bits and therefore for information, you don't have to particularly choose a specific law of motion. You can just state it at this level. And in that way, you've captured what is in common between all of these different laws in a very powerful way, in a way that, for example, allows you to also state what makes these laws testable, because the fact that a specific law can be tested requires the fact that these two very simple properties are permitted by the specific law in question. And it so happens that all the laws we've come up with have these properties that they allow for bits. And it's not by chance, in a sense.
Yes, there's another view about what information is, which I think was kind of posited by Wheeler and others. It's this idea that information, it's the idea of it from bit. And I think your view is different, right? Like in your view, physical systems, there's laws about physical systems which determine whether or not they can store information. And that kind of makes it tangible. It isn't like the world is just information or something. You really have theories about the behavior of objects, and specifically this counterfactual theory of what can and cannot be done to certain objects. And from that, you have a theory of information, but it's not like you're positing that everything is information like Wheeler did.
No, I think this was one of the things that when I was working with David, I found most appealing in this theory, that, as you said, in most of the views of to talk about information within physics is to say, well, maybe it's like a foundation for everything else, and that leaves this question of what are the physical regularities that allow for information unanswered. And it's not very satisfactory if you want a foundation, if you want to build kind of deeper foundations for other laws that you already have. And instead, with this constructive theory of information, you can go at the heart of that question and get somehow bit from it, where you sort of say, well, no, information is actually about these regularities that are permitted in nature, and they're all about counterfactuals. And once you express those, you've expressed a bunch of interesting properties of the current laws that we have, which we didn't know about before. So in that sense, it's very, we take for granted this fact that information is interoperable, the fact that it can be copied from one system to another and so on. But it's really a deep property of physical reality, which we, the laws don't have necessarily to display. And the fact that they do display, the laws have this property, has a host of very important other consequences. And things like computers and other things, universal computers even, and so on, wouldn't exist without that. So yeah, it's a very nice fact that counterfactuals allow you to capture that.
Very nice. The other kind of area, so we've talked about information theory, and we've talked about, to some extent, about thermodynamics. But the other area where your research has really been interesting is in biology, where again, there's counterfactual properties that animals have, and that things like replicators have, which just like all these other features that we've been discussing, kind of the theme of both the book and the talk, I guess, is there's counterfactual properties of biological systems that are not properly described within fundamental physics, and these are related to properties of information through, I think, what you call receipts. So recipes.
Yeah.
And yeah, again, just so how do you incorporate kind of biological systems, genes, and such things into fundamental physics?
So this is a problem that arose in a context which is a bit amusing in a sense. So I think embarrassingly, if you look at the founding fathers of quantum theory, well, a number of them have tried to talk about how life fits into physics, and this is a very nice thing. So there are great writings by Schrödinger and other people which are really cool. However, some of the founding fathers ended up from these very nice premises into concluding things that were not quite right. And so particularly there was this argument by Wigner, who is a renowned kind of physicist, who somehow concluded that a self-replicator, something that works like a cell that can self-reproduce in a very accurate way, would allegedly violate the laws of quantum theory and would require additional laws to be explained than just the microscopic laws that we know of. And the way in which he concluded this was based on the fact that he was trying to assess understand the existence of objects like bacteria that are self-reproducing by answering the question, how probable are these entities given some dynamical laws and initial conditions? And of course, the answer to that question is that they are very improbable by some measure. So there are lots of things that are very improbable, and particularly, unfortunately, bacteria and us, we are also very improbable, and so on. But what he missed is that, and I think not just him, I think at the time, because we didn't know about DNA yet, or we just knew about it, there was a lack of methodology at least in the physics community, to even pose the question, how is life possible, given that the laws of physics are not designed specifically for life? I think that's the kind of key question. And somehow Wigner turned into, can we say that life is highly probable? And of course, the answer is no. But that doesn't mean that life is not possible, given the laws of physics that we know, unless you have a designer. And in order to make the point that life is actually possible without a designer and with simple elementary laws, you can just use basically Darwinian theory of evolution, which does most of the heavy lifting that's needed for this kind of explanation. And on top of it, you can add some constructive theoretic argument, which is the stuff that I did, in order to show that the assumptions of the theory of evolution as we know it are not in conflict with the regularities of the elementary laws that we have. And specifically, Darwin's theory of evolution to work only needs these features that I mentioned earlier. Basically, that the laws have to allow for counterfactuals that are those which allow information to be possible. And so in that sense, you can make a nice argument which bridges the much higher level explanatory set of tools that Darwin's theory of evolution has, and the lower level dynamical explanations that we have at the level of the fundamental laws of nature. And with constructive theory, you can show that the counterfactuals required by Darwin's theory for life to arise, to be possible, are nothing but these simple requirements that underlie information in general. And so this is a very nice argument, and somehow it refutes some of these claims that are even popular within the physics community, that we can't quite explain life within physics. The reason why we can't explain it is just because we're using the wrong tools, and that was the case in the case of Wigner's. And hopefully with the counterfactual argument, I think all of these arguments are now put to rest.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to think how stuck he must have been in the prevailing conception, because it seems like the whole idea that you want to say something is probable, like that saying that something should occur kind of accidentally, like things are just occurring accidentally, and we wanted to explain why the rate of occurrence is somehow very high. But as you said, like life is it isn't very likely to occur, but that's partly because it is resilient against, like it has built into it a way of solving the fact that it's very difficult for life to occur. It has had to solve problems for it to keep itself instantiated.
Yeah.
And that is a whole aspect of life that you would miss if you were just thinking about it in terms of, okay, well, how likely is it that this thing occurs? Because it's not about the likelihood, it's about how much, well, knowledge it has and how much problems it has solved, or its genes have solved in order to stay alive.
Yes, and I think an explanation, a theory that just gave you some initial conditions that guarantee that life arises, like giraffes or elephants arise at some point in the universe, wouldn't satisfy the questions that people like creationists, for example, have in the form of, oh, but how does the elephant arise without design? Because the law that you're talking about may well contain the design of the elephant, or the initial conditions may well do that. So in a sense, it's crucial to have an argument that underlies that highlights this fact that you don't need design at any step of the process for an elephant to be possible. And this, of course, as you said, relies on knowledge and so on. But at the same time, the type of explanation that traditional conception would naturally provide doesn't quite make that argument, because the dynamical law can be designed and can be very special or unusual in the set of all laws. And so it wouldn't satisfy a very skeptical creationist who doesn't believe in the idea that this law actually is actually contains design. And so the same holds for some of these programs that simulate features of life arising from simple origins, like there are some programs like the Game of Life and so on that are trying to show that there's a way of getting complexity out of very simple beginnings. But again, there is a lot of difficulty in even checking that such proposals are actually acceptable, because we don't have, other than these initial steps that I propose with constructive theory, we don't have a good theory of what counts as non-designed, what counts as a law that doesn't contain design in it of a specific object, for example, giraffe. And this is it's an interesting problem in a way, even for mathematicians, for example, to come up with models for expressing this idea. And certainly probability doesn't do the job, at least not fully.
Yeah, it reminds me of a criticism Popper had of Bayesianism. So I think in his Logic of Scientific Discovery, he wrote something about how the theories that we actually end up testing, their probability of being true tends to be very low, because the more trivial a theory is, the more higher the probability is that it's true. So the theories that we want to test are very low in being, or have a very low probability. And that kind of sounds like a similar issue, where saying that we want life to have a very high probability, somehow that's kind of missing the whole point of the explanation.
Yes.
Then at the end of the book, you talk about knowledge and about the idea of incorporating that within fundamental physics. And I thought that was fascinating, the idea that maybe, like we have laws about information and other physical systems, we might also at some point have laws about knowledge, about creativity, about how those things evolve, and how whether programs that are creative, or if such things exist, can be copied onto other media and things like that. Yeah, I guess that was the more open-ended part. But what are your views about knowledge and the possibility of incorporating it?
One of the things that pertains to this part of constructive theory that hasn't been, let's say, worked out fully yet. And there's a lot of that. So in a sense, the book is about a program that contains some work that we've been doing, and then lots of future things that we are hoping to be doing. And it was one of the things that really got me interested in the program in the first place, when somehow David was promoting this view that somehow knowledge, as intended in Popperian epistemology, can also be translated into, transposed into physics in the form of a specific kind of information being now this thing that can be copied and permuted in all possible ways. So when I say information, it's not some fluffy stuff. It's defined in this way through counterfactuals as a physical property of laws. So this information that has an additional property, which is, as you said, the property of being resilient. So it's information that has the ability to remain embodied in physical systems over the years, over the centuries, and so on. And so if you take this nice conceptual step that I think David made in this original paper on constructive theory, a lot of new questions become now available to physics to ask, because once you make this step that you connect knowledge with a particular type of, you identify knowledge with a particular type of information that's embodied in physical systems and has this resilience property, then you can wonder, you can ask questions that have to do with what are the regularities that this type of information obeys, what displays, and so on. And so, for example, there are all these questions to do with, is it possible to come up with a law that says that once knowledge emerges in a certain context, then some other things become possible in the form of, there is maybe an arrow of the creation of knowledge, and so on, in the same way that we could talk about an arrow of time, for example, and et cetera, et cetera. And I think these questions have always been voiced in the physics community one way or another, but it's very hard to address them without having an objective handle on knowledge itself. And I'm very hopeful, because I think constructive theory provides this handle. So at the moment it's very qualitative. It doesn't have a quantitative aspect to it and so on. But I'm very excited because it could allow us to crack these two problems. One is, could we have a physical theory for the knowledge that's created, say, through things like natural selection? And could we have a physical theory of the knowledge that's created through thinking and conjectures and refutation and so on? And I think, although we haven't answered these questions yet, and I think, so David is working a lot on this on the universal constructor, which is like a general machine that is generalizing the idea of a universal computer, for which knowledge is very important, and somehow, so in a sense, that will be part of this theory of knowledge. But I think most of the, most of this theory of knowledge I'm talking about has yet to be created. But I'm very hopeful because it allows us to have this objective handle on the concept. And I think this is it's very nice if physicists take on board that this is a problem for physics, and it's not just, maybe a question for, I don't know, biology or maybe computer scientists and so on. So in a sense, I think it's a very promising first step.
Very nice. Yeah, I think that definitely everyone here, I imagine, is on board with that, since this is the Popper Society. Yeah. That being said, yeah, I think this is the right time to open the floor for questions. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat, and I can ask it for you. I see Sadia has a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Chiara. How are you doing?
Hi.
Yeah, I have a question. Have you thought about the implications? Because I've been thinking about what sort of implications constructor theory might have for the early universe close to the Big Bang. I guess the sort of question I have in mind is, I know you said that this is more kind of qualitative right now, but I'm kind of thinking more about, do you see any immediate implications about why these laws, like where did these laws of nature come from? Why these laws and not any other laws?
So I guess this question could be asked about the very principles of constructor theory. So in a way, I don't think there is an answer within constructor theory to this specific question, because you could ask the same question, this very question, about the principles that we are proposing ourselves. So you could say, why these principles and not others? And ultimately, I think the answer is that there could be a deeper explanation. So in a way, there is no ultimate answer to that question, in my view. You can maybe find a problem that currently can't be addressed with the, with the laws we know, or with the principles that we come up with. And then maybe there'll be that means that there is like a deeper law that awaits to be discovered in a sense. And this is true very much both in the traditional conception as well as in constructor theory. But so this more general question, I think the answer would be the same for both the traditional conception and constructor theory's principle, as well as other laws of physics that you might think of. But in regard specifically to the type of constraints, so to what constructor theory can do about the theories of the initial conditions, there is certainly something that we can do. And the logic should go as follows, that so at the moment, what cosmology does is to conjecture some mechanism through which, from given initial conditions, we can get the present state of the universe. And this is not very satisfactory because it's ad hoc and lacks explanatory power in a way. That's at least the way I think about this. But with principles, with constructor theory, you can provide a number of explanatory principles that explain regularities of subsystems of the universe. So about what's possible and impossible on them. And these principles, if they are strong enough in their censorship in a way, will rule out a whole class of initial conditions as well as a whole class of dynamical models from the possible ones. And so in this sense, they will put many more constraints on this possible class of initial conditions, thereby explaining why we should have at least one of these initial conditions within the allowed set. So that's the logic through which this new type of explanation could work. in a way strengthening the current principles that we already have. And so that's I would say the logic of a research program in that direction. But I don't know. I don't know of any specific example.
May I ask you what you said at the end, or I'm sorry, I don't want to, is there anybody else who wants to go next, or can I ask something regarding what you just said?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
So the constraints you're talking about, it sounds to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds to me that those constraints somehow depend on what we find the world to be at this moment, right? Is it right? In that sense, isn't that kind of like how our fundamental theories are right now, where, for example, masses and all those certain constants that we set they're set from empirical data and not really emerge out of the theory? Tell me if I'm...
Yes, yeah. I understand what you're saying, but I think the empirical data that we are based some of these conjectures on are not the only thing why these conjectures are there. So in a sense, the principles are much more explanatory and they have more reach than just the empirical data that they happen to explain. So in a sense, the reason why we choose some principles versus others is because we have a theory, we have a somehow an explanatory theory. We think we have an explanatory theory for why these principles are actually better than others that have been conjectured. And then, if I think this is, as I said, this is a question that applies as much to the principles that we have as to other laws of physics, that if they happen to become problematic at any point, we can then conjecture new ones. But the interesting thing about these principles that I'm talking about is that they're not primarily formulated in terms of dynamics and initial conditions. And so we are thinking that they have more explanatory reach than just these theories that we currently have. So in that sense, yes, they are formulated in a way that they are explanatory of the things we see now, but that's not the only reason why we think that they are the right principle. And then if they turn out to be problematic, we'll change them. But what we are conjecturing is that the mode of explanation is better suited to solve this problem with initial conditions than the traditional conceptions method.
Great. Then I see Javid Laka. I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. You have a question. You have your hand raised. Go ahead if you want.
Hi. I enjoyed reading your book a lot, in particular the physical definition of knowledge as information that is capable of perpetuating its own existence or an abstract catalyst. One thing I noticed that throughout the book, the examples of knowledge given was either DNA or explanatory theories, or, as you put it, conjecture and criticism in the mind, variation and natural selection in the wild. Do there exist in the universe that we know about other forms of knowledge, or is there something which restricts it to these two classes?
Yeah, well, that's a very nice question. And I think broadly speaking, I don't think we know of any other example. But my expectation is that there should be many other possible, meaning physically allowed examples. It's just that we haven't stumbled upon them yet, or we haven't created them within our own civilization. And in a sense, the nice thing about the definition of knowledge is that it's general enough that it will allow us to somehow identify what counts as knowledge, even though it doesn't conform necessarily to these two well-known patterns that we already have, let's say, partially studied. So I think there's this big problem in astrobiology where people are trying to come up with criteria for life in general, right? So they are pointing telescopes around in the universe and trying to get signals, and they're looking for signatures of life elsewhere in the universe. And it's actually very interesting that there are no good, I mean, at least as far as they say, or at least as far as I can say, there doesn't seem to be a universal good criterion for what is it you should be looking for. And so I'm hoping that if this definition of knowledge is worked out fully and even applied to this field, maybe this question could be answered and we could have a much better criterion for what exactly we're looking for when we are looking for signatures of life. And yes, I think it's very nice that the definition is flexible enough to incorporate different kinds of knowledge from the ones that we already know.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the question. Yeah.
Okay, then we have Chloe Lee. I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks for speaking. I have a few questions that are kind of just interrelated, if that's okay. The first is, I was wondering how does your constructor theory connect to the idea of reductionism, since you spoke about how there could be potentially a physical theory of knowledge, like knowledge created through natural selection, and does that imply that this kind of, if you reform physics in this way to have a theory of knowledge, that this reformed physics under the constructor theory would subsume a knowledge that we have in biology about natural selection, because the constructor theory would instead kind of imply all of these if you just work it out and expand it? Or do you think that the constructor theory is less of a theory of physics, but more kind of a meta approach to how knowledge could be expressed in general?
So if I understand your question correctly, so you're asking whether, just to clarify it a bit, are you asking whether constructor theory provides a more fundamental theory of knowledge than, say, biology? Is that the kind of context in which you're asking the question, just to understand more broadly where you're coming from?
Yeah, just relative to the more emergent fields of study, how does this kind of, if you adopt this theory, does that mean the theories of biology and psychology and so on, they become less fundamental because they could be formulated instead under this constructor theory?
So I don't think that the whole of biology would or other disciplines that exist at that level of explanation would be reduced to this, for example, theory of knowledge that we could have in constructor theory. But what I think what constructor theory would do is to root some of the concepts that are important for biology within physics in an exact way. So without using these methods of approximations that are currently needed in order to, say, talk about, I don't know, macroscopic systems like living systems and so on, which unfortunately miss the point of why living systems are actually interesting from the point of view of at least physics. So in that sense, I don't think biology would be at all reduced to constructor theory, but I think what constructor theory does is to provide a bridge between whatever bits of biology you're talking about and fundamental regularities of the laws of nature. And this is very nice because this could help, for example, to single out some more robust features that you may find in some of these theories of biology, in the sense that these features are not dependent on specific details of the particular organism, for example, that you're talking about, or the particular chemistry that the organism is based on, but they are universal. In the same way that things like the quantum theory of information, or more generally the theory of information, does when talking about laws of computation. So these laws are not, they uncover some regularities which are very fundamental in physics as well. And that allows us to see that there are also regularities that underlie the behavior of computing machines, both of the ones that we already have constructed in the technologies that we can master at this time, but also for computers that may be constructed in the future and may use technology that we can't even think of at the moment. So in that sense, I guess I'm not claiming complete reduction of these other fields to, say, the theory of knowledge that comes out of constructive theory, but I'm hoping that this will provide a more unified way of looking at some of the aspects of these fields, because they're all rooted within physics.
So if say you have a theory of knowledge of how you have a theory, if you use the constructor theory to develop a theory of knowledge that characterizes knowledge created by natural selection, does that theory add to the existing theory of natural selection? Does it kind of sit beside it, or would it just be a different perspective?
It adds to it because it makes it, it connects it to fundamental laws of physics. So at the moment, the theory of natural selection is something that exists at this higher level, and doesn't have a way of saying, of constraining, for example, the laws of physics that we know of at the moment. So, you know, when you describe Darwin's theory, you are assuming that there are some regularities in nature secretly, in a sense, but you never spell out what these are. And so if we work out this theory of knowledge, there'll be a way of then, in a way, augmenting the theory of evolution in a way that it will be more powerful, in my view. But I mean, the core of the explanation is still Darwin's, of course. However, it will be a way of using the theory of evolution to somehow constrain the laws of physics. So that's, I think that's the direction in which the logic goes.
I was wondering if, so from what I understood, is that this constructor theory is mainly kind of for physicists to reformulate their own theory so that you can get rid of the reasoning about things like life from probabilities and initial conditions, and having a more applicable theory of physics that can, you know, sit compatibly with theories within biology. But that's mostly for physicists to kind of improve their own theories. Would a biologist ever find an occasion to use this constructor theory within biology? Would a biologist need to consider this constructor theory, or would it have any kind of impact on how knowledge may be improved within biology?
Yes, I think so one thing that I didn't mention during the conversation with Sam was that the very origins of constructor theory are in an attempt that the physicists made to have a set of laws that apply to a universal model for living systems, and this was von Neumann. So von Neumann had this idea to generalize this Turing machine idea, so a Turing machine is like this model machine that when you talk about the universal Turing machine, can compute all computations that are physically allowed. And so somehow out of that came the theory of computers that allowed current computers to exist. And then von Neumann realized that some tasks that are permitted in nature are not in the repertoire, are not in the range of computations that a Turing machine can perform, because they are not computations. So they are different kinds of transformation. And the chief example that von Neumann gave is the task of self-reproducing. So computer can be programmed to self-reproduce. It can simulate self-reproduction within its own workspace, but that's not the same as constructing a new replica of itself. And so von Neumann had this idea of the universal constructor, which is a machine that can be programmed to perform any transformation that's physically allowed. And constructive theory and the theory of knowledge should provide the theory for the underlying theory for this machine, in the same way that the Turing machine theory was then the working theory to build an actual computer, like the computers that we are using at the moment. And so in a sense, the regularities that underlie these constructors and the way they can be composed and so on should provide fundamental limitations to the physics of life, because living organisms, among other things, are instances of approximate constructors. And so the theory of constructors as intended, within constructor theory, is going to provide some kind of physical fundamental limitation on what living systems can do, which is something that biology currently doesn't have, because biology is more a descriptive, explanatory science, but mostly is about what we currently see in the biosphere, let's say. There are also, of course, other implications from from what we know about DNA and so on, that say something about what surely we won't be able to see, let's say, in the biosphere anytime soon. But somehow the constructor theory is aiming at a much more fundamental set of limitations, a bit like the limitations that thermodynamics puts on heat engines. And so in that sense, I think this will be a nice, interesting thing for biology, because it will put some constraints within which maybe new biology theories can be formulated, even about forms of life that may not exist on this planet, but on other planets, etc.
That's really interesting. Just like a kind of a tiny question for the biologists. If they want to use this theory to kind of make biological theories about what kind of life can occur, what kind of conditions, would a biologist need to learn physics and learn about computation theories to be able to use this, to be able to understand this constructor theory? How might a biologist use this?
I think mathematically speaking, so in terms of background knowledge that's needed, I don't think you need to, if you're interested in biology, I don't think one is required to know any of the physics applications of constructor theory, really. It's mostly, I guess, some bits of mathematics like set theory and algebra and so on. So some very basic mathematical tools. And a bit of the theory of computation in the sense that it helps to know the concept of a repertoire and programmable machines, etc., etc.
Very nice.
Thanks for
the answers. Yeah. And then we have Michael. Michael, go ahead.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for your lovely, wonderful book. We really appreciate it, and thank you for this great talk. It's been fascinating. I've really enjoyed it. I just wondered if you could explain a bit more about this concept of resilience in knowledge and resilience in information, and specifically how one might think about quantifying a concept like resilience. Is something like reducing environmental randomness or something that might interfere with the transmission of the information or the knowledge, or how could one quantify a concept of that something is more or less resilient?
Yes, well, this is a great question. I think it's part of this interesting set of things that I'm hoping that physics will crack somehow by going along this direction that I was describing earlier, of starting exactly with this definition of knowledge that's exact and objective, etc. And I think the way I see some possible ways of conjecturing an answer to this question is that there has to be a primitive notion that you assume, which is given to you by physics. So physics has to say, the physical laws, there has to be a notion from physics that says what counts as an elementary entity. And so roughly speaking, elementary things are things that are somehow abundant in the universe and are given to you as some sort of fundamental building blocks that you declare as things that don't require design to be resilient. So you have to have some conjecture about what those are. And let's say you don't question that. So you say, for us, it could be elementary particles, fields, and stuff like that. And once you have that, then one interesting thing to, one interesting bit of this quantitative theory of knowledge could be connecting the amount of resilience of a given system within a certain environment, therefore within a certain noisy environment, let's say, and the amount of appearance of design that this system must have. So the appearance of design is this slightly old-fashioned word that I think biologists might be still using to refer to the interconnectedness of a given organism, specifically to the fact that organisms have a number of different subparts that are all fine-tuned to each other, in the form that if you slightly alter one of these subparts, then the whole organism ceases to work. So it kind of goes wrong in a really bad way. So a small perturbation in one of these subparts leads to a huge perturbation at the level of the organism. And so there is a qualitative hand-waving notion of appearance of design. So we can say that an organism like our body, for example, has appearance of design. And this is this usual Paley argument about the watch, right? So this argument that was made at the time, where so the idea was that if you find a watch on the beach, and then you got to, because it has the appearance of design, you have to conclude that there must have been a designer around to create it. And of course, that's a flawed argument. But I think Paley got right the notion of appearance of design right, in the sense it's a thing that pertains to living beings. And so it would be very interesting to have a way of quantifying the resilience of a specific entity which isn't elementary, with its degree of appearance of design. And then you could connect those two things with the number of elementary steps that you need in order to bring that entity about. And now this is an example of a quantitative theory that could be created out of the current things that we have in constructive theory. We don't have that yet, but I think, so there are I have some collaborators that are working along these lines, and also what David is doing, I think is something very relevant to this, because of course the universal constructor has some necessary architecture, which already von Neumann in a sense highlighted, which displays in a sense a high degree of appearance of design. And this corresponds to the fact that it is adapted to accept lots of different programs, lots of different types of knowledge that can be slotted into this universal machine to create anything that is physically allowed. And all of these things currently are very qualitative, but I think there's a quantitative theory that we can take out, that we can create. And I think that would be very interesting, because then we would have predictive statements as well about specific, biological systems, for example.
Thank you. That's very interesting. Can I ask one quick follow-up question? It seems that when one speaks about constructors, one is already speaking about something that is quite, that one is almost assumes to be quite resilient. It's something that's a constructor itself. So is there any sense of the evolution of constructors to be constructors?
Yes, so I think the notion of a constructor is idealized in a way, but I think there is a theory of approximate constructors, which ultimately boils down to catalysis in a sense. So in a sense, in a way, part of understanding how accurate constructors can come about is, to understand how simple approximate constructors, which are in the first instance chemical catalysts, can aggregate themselves together to get to a higher level of accuracy in a sense. and to a wider range of tasks that they can perform. And I think the maybe an upgraded version of the theory of evolution, which we could come up with by combining it with the notions of constructor theory, will include a better understanding of these origin of life theories that currently are, well, I think they are convincing to me, but I have lots of friends, I think, in physics who are not so happy about them because they are not very quantitative about, the various steps of the way in which you get from naked replicators, which are not so good constructors, to the point of having a bacterium. And so I think it's
exactly. It's an interesting question. How does one construct constructors in a way that there's kind of a bit of a regress there, because of course chemical catalysts, I think, right, are not in fact they don't keep working, though, enzymes, enzymes break down and they don't keep working. They need to be, if you will, reconstructed and reconstructed in a way to be them. So the issue of constructing constructors seems to be relevant. How does that fundamentally happen seems relevant.
Yes, and I think there is this. So the hope is that you can route the explanation for high level constructors that are very accurate into the these elementary constructors that you don't whose existence you don't question. So, for example, catalysts that are just chemical elements and so on. And in this sense, this is similar to the theory of error correction in quantum and classical computing, that when you have like a routine to perform error correction at a higher level in an algorithm, you have to, there are various theorems that show that you have to make sure that you perform error correction on the subroutines of this routine up to a certain level of depth, and you can let the very, very elementary steps almost uncorrected for, and you can tolerate a certain amount of error at that level to achieve a good, accurate computation overall. And this form of convergence is similar to the one that one would be hoping for to explain how accurate constructors can come out of just these simple assumptions about very elementary constructors being there in nature without intervention of any constructor.
Thank you. Very interesting. So that is, in a sense, about what amount of randomness can one tolerate and still have a and still have a construction. And that's the part that I'm interested in, because that's it's almost an economic discussion on how much supply of randomness and how much is tolerable for something to continue. But that's interesting. Thank you. Brilliant. I just really enjoy the way you think about this.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't see any questions at the moment. I might just ask a final question about something that you kind of mention in the book, which is the possibility of incorporating the idea of free will into physics. And this, I guess I can rephrase that as like, in general, we view counterfactuals have a weird status within physics still. And I often have conversations with people about like how to explain the fact that something other than actually happened could have happened. And for example, in the book, you have the story of Theseus, who comes home to, I think, Athens, and his father and him had an agreement that if his sail was a certain color, then that communicated whether or not Theseus had died or not on his journey. And Theseus's sail was the color that indicated that he had died and his father committed suicide. And in that story, you say the whole point of the story is that something could have been communicated by the sail being a certain color. And I think something people would say against this, people who are, again, like kind of stuck with the prevailing conception and who also do not quite like this idea of free will being incorporated into the world, they would say, well, that is just a kind of a parochial human point of view. If Thesis's father would have been able to look up like what the actual dynamical laws would have been, then he might have been able to tell that there wasn't any other way for the ship to have that, the color that it did, for the sails of the ship to have the color that it did. I think this is wrong, but I'm curious what your defense of it would be. This is kind of trying to play devil's advocate. How you defend this view that counterfactuals really are real, and there is a sense in which the sail could have had a different color, even though in actuality it had the color that it had.
Yes, well, I think the example in question was was intended to indicate that there are some kinds of stories that you can't tell without appealing to counterfactuals. So in that sense, it was less ambitious than what you're saying now, in the form of I hadn't thought of having this way of using the example also to somehow connect to the question of free will. So it's a very nice point you're making. I think the answer there would be that along the lines of some of these, I think, arguments that others have made, that when one says, oh, you could have had the dynamical laws and the theory of initial conditions, and you could have worked out, if you were Thesis' father, what decision Thesis actually made about the sails. So when we say all of these things, when the devil's advocate says all of these things, a lot of things are being fudged under the carpet, including the fact that we assume we have a theory with which you can assess whether it is actually possible to do such and such a thing with the kind of resources, with the constrained resources that the particular situation has. So in order to simulate or emulate thesis decisions, you would have to bring about someone, a program that has exactly the same properties as Thesis and is actually a clone of Thesis in some way. So at the moment, we can't quite make a watertight argument about this, but it would be very nice to use, for example, constructive theory concept to pin down some impossibility argument, a kind of no-go theorem that says that in certain circumstances, it's impossible to predict what another individual will do unless an exact copy of that individual is brought about with the same range and set of thoughts as the person you're trying to, whose behavior you're trying to predict. So this is currently, I think these arguments exist in some qualitative form, and part of the reason is that we are not quite clear about, we don't have a good way of talking about the very notion of free will. I think there are lots of different ways in which people think about free will. But if you wanted to have a watertight definition or explanation for it, no one has it at the moment. And
Yes.
part of the reason is precisely because we don't have a good theory of knowledge within physics. That's at least what I think. And so it's a bit like, I like this analogy that I think Sarah Walker, who is this astrobiology that works with Paul Davis and other collaborators in Arizona. She has this nice analogy that says that when we're talking about these things, it's a bit like when, we're a bit like people before the theory of gravity, before, say, Newton's laws, trying to understand the motion of objects, the motion of objects being dropped from towers and etc. So we would say, oh, when you've got an object with something and it's heavy and then you launch it out of the window, then usually it does this, but then, then we try with different objects and then try to say, oh, this one goes faster than the other one, no, but actually it doesn't, and so on and so forth. So we were trying to get to the concept of mass and gravity, but we didn't have that. So it was very hard to even talk about the motion of objects that are launched out of the window and so on. And so similarly now, I think when we talk about these concepts and even actually about life, we are to some degree in that state. So we need more work, a lot more conceptual tools to even just formulate the problem specifically. And I'm hoping that constructive theory helps with this. I think it's a viable, good tool. So I'm really excited that maybe it will be usable by some of these people who are interested in this problem to work it out.
Very nice. Yeah, here. And I think, as I said at the start of the talk, that is part of what makes the book fun. It's you're exploring things which are definite problems within physics at the moment, and it's very exciting to read a book where you see like, oh, maybe there is actually this thing that's wrong with our current worldview, and maybe we have answers, and they're not conclusive entirely. Like, there's still things to do, but that's exciting. And yeah, I highly recommend everyone reads the book. It's excellent.
Yes, and maybe one final remark is this, that I think in physics, maybe this is of interest to this audience in a way, because what I think has happened is that in physics, there has been a phenomenon by which people have stopped questioning the laws, as you know, the laws we have at the moment are very problematic, and I think we see this every time we're trying to solve a problem. And I guess, well, for example, Sam, you with your work as well, right, we're trying to kind of understand some of these variants of quantum theory and so on. So the laws as we have them now are, for example, quantum field theory, which is a huge part of physics, was initially conceived as a work in progress by the very people who suggested it. But it's been around for more than 50 years now, and somehow we stopped questioning, we stopped looking for problems, and the problems that are there we just ignore. And that's something that is not good, even from the epistemological point of view, because actually problems are really opportunities. They should be considered very, very carefully and used as springboards to find some new stuff that's more interesting and more hopefully in some sense a lot closer to truth. So I'm hoping that I think I'm hoping that the book will serve at least as a as a way of saying, well, maybe you don't buy the idea of constructive theory, but you should really consider a bit more the possibility of finding new ways of thinking about the stuff that we are currently considering in physics and in science and more generally.
Yeah, it's nicely multi-layered. There's these kind of threads throughout the book, as you said, where it's not just the object level discussion is about constructive theory, but then there's this kind of meta level to the book where it's about actually having these discussions in general is really important. And as I said, I really enjoyed it.
Great, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming. This is excellent. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Thanks for the discussion, the questions, they were great.